Myths and misunderstandings can come about in many different ways in a game like Final Fantasy XIV. Sometimes because the game didn't ever explain how something works. Other times it tried, but it was in a text blurb and didn't explain it well. And yet other times players simply find their own answers through assumptions or expectations. I want to go over a handful of these kinds of claims, myths, and odd interactions, and either explain how they work, how they are false, or if they even are false in the first place. And if you know of some strange myths or claims you would like tested or explained, be sure to share them in the comments. Now, let's get myth busting. Number 1. How exactly does syncing down work? There are a bunch of different myths and claims about how syncing works in particular. Outside of, say, doing old ultimates, it rarely matters beyond what many would consider excessive optimization. However, both due to the context of the somewhat recent occult Croissant release with a syncing item level of 700, as well as just general interest and understanding, it might be interesting to review exactly how it all works. When you queue up for a duty, in the description of the duty, it designates both a minimum level as well as a level cap, the syncing cap, you could say. On top of this, many duties will also designate an item level cap, and also a minimum item level at times. When you enter this duty synced, your level is, obviously, reduced to the level restriction, and then each piece of equipment you have is individually checked. If the item is within the restrictions set by the duty, then the item is allowed to exist as it is. If, however, it falls outside those restrictions, the item gets synced. To be clear, the restrictions can even include unmentioned details. For instance, if a quote-unquote high-level dungeon has a level restriction but no item level restriction, it still technically has an item level restriction. Items with a level requirement above the indicated level of the duty will still get synced, and the item level sync can be lower than the maximum allowed item level itself. For example, the Lunar Subterrane has a level restriction of 90, and the highest item level equipment at level 90 is 660, except for weapons, which go up to 665. If you bring a legitimate item level 665 weapon with a level 90 requirement, like a relic, to the duty, it will not be synced. But if you instead bring a Dawntrail weapon, it will get synced to item level 660, not 665. An additional final note here is that even if the equipment's item level is within the restrictions of the duty, if the level requirement is above it, it will still get synced. This means, for instance, that a level 92 crafted piece of equipment, item level 655, would still be synced in a level 90 duty with no item level restrictions, meaning technically an item level restriction of 660. So with that out of the way, what does that mean? What does it mean for equipment to be synced? When gear is synced, the first thing that happens is that all materia turns off. In other words, the materia on the piece of equipment stops giving stats. To take the example from before, while an item level 655 crafted piece could get 5 materia melded into it as it is a crafted piece, in a level 90 duty, the materia would turn off as the item gets synced to level 90. The second thing that happens when equipment gets synced is that the item level is effectively squished to the appropriate item level, assuming it isn't already below it as with the I-655 piece. Item level, in a way, is what determines how much of a stat a piece of equipment can hold. When you open the materia melding window for a piece of equipment, you can see this threshold. A high quality item, or a dungeon or raid drop, will have the maximum vitality and primary attribute the item could hold, as well as, usually, at least one of its properties maxed out, the primary property, and the other be less than that, the secondary property. For comparison, a normal quality crafted item only has 90% of the possible amount of stats. However, if you attempt to meld an item, you can indeed see that the item will have the capacity to have both of the properties maxed out, and can even get points in additional properties if you like. When an item so is synced down, the maximum amount of stats you get to use on the item is reduced, but the actual stats on it are not. So, for example, if I were to enter the Lunar Subterrane with my Historia staff here, it would get synced down to item level 660 like we discussed before. We can tell on the Augmented Ignis Malus from Endwalker that this would reduce the Historia staff to 410 Vitality, 409 Intelligence, and at most 303 in any properties on it. Meaning the critical hit stat would go down to 303, while the spell speed stat would stay at 284 as it is below that threshold. However, the spell speed materia would stop functioning altogether. That is, in essence, how syncing down works. So, how can you use this knowledge for your benefit? Well, first off, while leveling, you are likely to enter a lot of duties where you get synced down. In all of those duties, your materia won't matter anyway, so you could save some cash by simply not bothering to meld there. Second, and this mainly matters for optimization for ultimates and the like. Typically, chest pieces, paints, and weapons, but not for Paladin, have so many stats on them that the materia slots would not be able to max out the secondary property. As such, typically bringing chest and pants with an overwhelming item level relative to the duty will give you more stats at the end of the day than using an appropriate item level piece with materia in it. This can sometimes also happen for accessories if the appropriate item level piece only has one materia slot. Meanwhile, hats, gloves, and boots typically do not have so many stats that 2 materia wouldn't be able to produce more total stats on an appropriate item level piece. For this reason, item level synced optimal gear sets, like for old ultimates, tend to use recent weapons, chests, and pants, sometimes also accessories, and then may use item level appropriate hats, gloves, and boots, assuming the available items at that item level actually have good properties. Finally, relic weapons tend to have a lot more properties baked in, and often forgo having materia slots entirely, meaning that they tend to get the best of both worlds. They get to both overwhelm the duty with properties and also not lose materia. This is particularly clear with Shadowbringer's relics, where you can fully customize their stats, so you can simply target the exact maximum property threshold for each property at the item level you want to sync to, and maximize all the value. Endwalker relics didn't offer quite as much freedom, but can also do this to some degree. But the simple conclusion is, syncing means that sometimes item level appropriate hats, gloves, and boots can be superior to higher item level gear that gets synced down to a duty. Aside from that, just aim to have the optimal stats on the equipment. Number 2. Ranged limit breaks in dungeons. When is it optimal to use it? And what if you have a mage and a ranged physical? Who should use it? Let's start with the damage difference between limit breaks. As was explained in a previous Mythbuster video, the damage of a limit break is entirely determined by the average item level of your party's weapons. This also means that a lone player with an I-710 weapon will do the same damage with limit break as 2 players with I-710 weapons or a whole raid with I-710 weapons. For a quick comparison, the Mage Limit Break one with I-710 deals about 160,000 damage per target. Ranged Physical deals 144k or so, and Melee deals 267k or so. Notably, the Melee LB takes about 3.86 seconds to perform in full, including the animation lock, where the other two takes 5.1 seconds. Fortunately, the difference is so great that this hardly matters. In a vacuum, both of the AoE limit breaks beat the melee one in raw damage on 2 or more targets, but beat it in damage per second on 3 or more targets. Now, Some of you might be thinking, wait, why are you comparing melee LB1 with the ranged and mage LB1s? Wouldn't you get an LB2 on the final boss of a dungeon? Yes and no. Your average group typically is just about to kill the boss anyway by the time LB2 rolls around, so most of the time you will get an LB1, not an LB2, and if you wait for the LB2, you will probably just get a big load of pocket fluff, I guess, as the cast will often just not finish. Groups that take long enough for LB2 to be reasonably helpful will be doing the duty itself slow enough that this whole discussion about what is optimal doesn't really matter that much. It is more about just beating the duty in the first place, and they probably should hold LB for melee to push through with. However, for the average group, the conversation becomes Mage LB for 160k per target or Ranged LB for 144k per target, scaling with higher or lower item level of course. In most polls, the Mage LB is considered much easier to aim as it has a wider, more easily placed area, while the ranged one is a straight line through your current target. But if we, for the moment, assume either limit break will hit all targets, then the main difference is that the ranged one deals about 10% less damage than the mage one. Open and shut case, you use the mage LB, right? Well, the one last thing to consider is opportunity cost. This also came up with the melee LB one in the previous video on this topic. Spending 5.1 seconds on a limit break means you're not spending those 5.1 seconds on something else. The ranged physical limit break in this example deals approximately 28.2k damage per second invested per target, while the mage one deals 31.4k. So it effectively comes down to who's doing more personal damage. And mages have a steeper hill to climb as they need to do an additional about 3.2k per target per second to justify them not being the one using the limit break. While we are in vacuum land anyway, let's say for the sake of example that both the mage and the ranged do about 5k AoE DPS, as in 5k per target per second. In that case, having the ranged do limit break would be a gain of 23.2k for those 5 seconds, while the mage LB would be a gain of 26.4k. Just from this observation alone, we can conclude that for the mage to weasel out of LB duty, they would have to do, well, about 3.2k more DPS per target than the ranged at the bare minimum. A lot of the time, who should limit break in these cases may come down to a combination of party composition and player skill and equipment. For instance, if one of the players is performing significantly worse, either due to gear or skill, they will benefit from LBing more. Otherwise, it may come down to what jobs are there. More supportive jobs may benefit from LBing, while more selfish jobs may benefit from attacking. A particularly unique example here is that an instant cast allows limit break to be cast during the GZD, meaning a Pictomancer could swift cast a motif and let the GZD tick for the majority of the limit break cast, making it almost free for them. A similar situation appears for Summoner's Slipstream. A final point to this is that these kinds of AoE pulls tend to go quite fast, so even if you believe or know that the other DPS should be LBing, not you, someone doing it is pretty much always superior to no one doing it or the correct person doing it way too late. However, roughly speaking, unless there is a colossal difference in performance between the mage and ranged, I'd argue that the mage is the better option in the average group, while the ranged doing it may likely be the better choice in a group that actually is trying to optimize this in some way. Number 3. Can you put Mug and Dokumori on the same target? Yes. Since Dawntrail caused Mug to upgrade into a different attack, Dokumori, that applies a distinctly different looking debuff to Mug to the target, the question is whether they stack. This can be easily tested on a striking dummy. Grab a friend, one of you needs Ninja at level 66 for Dokumori, the other can get away with Rogue at level 15 for Mug. Find a level 1 striking dummy and simply both use your action on it. As you can see, both effects appear. Based on prior precedents, we should be able to assume that they stack. However, if you want to be extra sure, test how much damage you do without either effect, then test with one and then with both, and observe the difference. Apparently, this trick was used for a really wacky trick in Baldessian Arsenal. And finally, number 4. Sacred Soil is not worth using over a simple Lustrate before Sacred Soil gains its regen effect at level 78. Not exactly. Before level 78, Sacred Soil is simply a 10% damage reduction AoE effect for around 17 seconds. In a way, damage reduction can be viewed as a sort of, quote, inverse healing effect, unquote, where the damage prevented can be viewed as healing instead, making it comparable to actual healing. Meaning, for example, that if Sacred Soil is active on an attack that deals 5,000 damage to a single player, Sacred Soil, quote-unquote, healed 500 damage. Because Sacred Soil spends the same resource that Lustrate does, and Lustrate has no real cooldown, any action that spends ether flow can be compared directly to either it or energy drain for the damage point of view. To take a simple example, in the level 50 duty Snowcloak, my Scholar set, synced down, causes my Lustrate to heal me for around 2,100. This means that for Sacred Soil to just break even with a non-critting Lustrate in value, in the 15 to 18 second time window Sacred Soil is active in, the party as a whole must take around 21,000 damage before Sacred Soil mitigation. Or, with Sacred Soil up, around 19,000 damage. That's quite a lot considering a Scholar has around 5.6k HP in this duty and a tank has around 8.7k. The tank would need to take more than twice their HP in damage if they are the only one taking damage during Sacred Soil. Or, at the very least, over 1,000 damage per second during Sacred Soil. If the tank takes less than that, it would be more healing value to simply use Lustrate to heal the tank when needed. However, there is one more side to this story. Damage reduction can allow you to survive damage that would otherwise kill you. As such, in duties with damage that can actually kill someone in a single blow, Sacred Soil suddenly skyrockets in value. However, on that note, if an attack could kill a light party off in a single blow at level 50, it would do more than a combined 21k damage with the Snowcloak values, so Sacred Soil would win on healing value here too anyway. However, again, in regular content, this basically never happens, so you would have to ascend to at least extremes or higher to see this happen, which does lead to a lot of cases where, indeed, Lustrate is better, outside of these extremes and such. Going back to the Snowcloak example though, there are several pulls in this dungeon that can do enough tank damage or party-wide damage that Sacred Soil is actually better too, but for the average player, the immediate results of Lustrate tends to just seem superior to the gradual value of Sacred Soil at a glance. Additionally, if the Scholar has to resort to spamming Adloquium or similar anyway, then Sacred Soil specifically can help even out the damage, making this even possible in the first place. So in conclusion, it kind of depends, but thinking ahead can often lead to Sacred Soil being superior, especially in an 8-man raid context. 21k damage in a level 50 duty spread across 8 players is just 2.6k, and that, I believe, can happen a few times on Titan Hard, just as an example. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you happen to come across or have a myth or claim you would like explained or tested. I do keep a list of these, so just because I didn't cover yours yet doesn't necessarily mean I skipped it. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, Scholars and Summoners shared access to the ability Shadow Flare, which plays down a circle AoE akin to Slipstream. Originally, it was a high MP cost spell with a long cast time. Uniquely for Scholar, they could not have Shadow Flare and Sacred Soil placed simultaneously, which some believe could also have caused the origin of this myth about Lustrate versus Sacred Soil.